When in early 1610 Leonello Spada set foot in the Grand Master's palace in Valletta, he would have witnessed a bare and austere building, devoid of many of the artistic treasures that we see today, but the place that had just hosted the artist Caravaggio. I'm Frederica Agius, and this lecture discusses the patronage pattern and literary sources for Leonello Spada's extensive fresco cycle of the early history of the order that complemented Matteo Peresalecco's frescoes on one side and Filippo Palladini's on the other. This forms part of the research for my PhD on the fresco cycle, and I would like to thank the Department of Art and Art History, especially Professor Kice Beras, for their constant support, and Heritage Malta for the opportunity to deliver this lecture and their on-site support at the Palace. Leonello Spada's fresco cycle of the early history of the Knights of St. John was executed in 1610 in 3 audience rooms at the Grand Master's Palace. Commissioned by Grand Master Alof de Wignacourt, the fresco's narrative has a complicated intellectual, didactic and propagandistic nature, which corresponds to the carefully edited story that the Knights of Malta wanted to give their troubled history. The frescoes celebrate the knight's virtuous legacy and demonstrate the sophistication of Wignacourt's patronage and his desire to project a work that reflects the manner in which grand palaces were decorated. I will here discuss the patronage pattern of the fresco cycle and the way it reflects the literary and visual sources for its heroic narrative. In reality, even though the 500-year-old history of the Order of St. John was dotted with successes and glorious moments, it was in general one of military retreat. Over the centuries, the knights were displaced further away from the city of Jerusalem, which was the very essence of their institution and existence. It seems to have become imperative that in their own magisterial palace, the knights presented a favourable heroic slant to what was essentially a history of refuge, which saw the order lose territories that had been in Christian hands during the 11th and 12th centuries. The result is a cycle that they would have seen to honour, promote and demonstrate the military achievements, religious duties and virtues of good governance to the elite audience of the palace. Indeed, at the onset of this commission, the order's chroniclers and the intellectuals behind Spada's decorative scheme had to face this issue and select episodes that responded to their desire to decorate their palace with a particularly favourable view of the order's history. In 1601, Alof de Wignacourt was elected as Grand Master of the Order and took up residence in the Grand Master's Palace. The Grand Master's Palace stands out in its setting, where it commands the space of the main square in Valletta, along the principal road of the city. The palace is rooted in the austere aesthetics of the early 1570s order, yet displays later, more decorative additions through subsequent Grand Masters, characteristic of its constant development, both in its interior and exterior embellishment. Spada's fresco cycle is located on the piano nobile of the building, along the section known as the summer wing, built in the 1580s during the reign of Grandmaster Verdal. The cycle of 24 episodes maps out the order's history in a chronological sequence over 3 Romes. The cycle begins in 1060 with the order's institution and narrates their movements through prominent personages in scenes of military campaigns, miraculous occurrences, and political alliances. The cycle concludes with their move to Viterbo in 1522, in the final episode, a few years prior to their transfer to Malta. After a first attempt at decorating these rooms in 1606, the Bolognese artist Leonello Spada was approached in 1609 with the task to represent this narrative. I have mentioned earlier how 2 main fresco cycles existed in the palace before Spada's cycle, and these were namely the work by Matteo Perestaleccio in the Grand Council Chamber and by Filippo Palladini in the private chapel, both situated on the Piano Nobile. Perestaleccio, a follower of the great Michelangelo, depicted a cycle narrating the events of the Great Siege of 1565, a glorious battle in the order's history carried out just a decade after its occurrence. D'Alecccio's narrative was laid out in framed quadri reportati, set in between allegories. The figures and setting in each of the fresco scenes show 2 different viewpoints, very typical of Mannerist works. However, the accuracy is seen in D'Alecccio's topography, where he provided one of the earliest painted maps of Malta. The Florentine artist, Filippo Palladini, frescoed the chapel with scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist. The 4 episodes were shown in a high frieze without framing allegories. Sibyls were instead grouped on the 2 shorter sides of the room. Palladini's narrative was lifted from the biblical story, whilst individual knights probably provided first-hand accounts for D'Alecccio's frescoes. On the other hand, Spada's cycle shows a studied and historically grounded narrative based on secondary literary sources from the order's own chronicler Giacomo Bozzio, and this study focuses on the relationship of the narrative and its sources. Spada's scheme combined 2 scenes per wall and 3 framing figures as a frieze along the upper part of each wall in the 3 rooms, in a format similar to the Great Siege frescoes at the Grandmaster's Palace and the mythological scenes at Palazzo Fava in Bologna by the Caravaggio artists. Spada's episodes are set as quadri reportati, identified by a descriptive titoli written in Italian on cartouches. The titolo plays a fundamental role in identifying the narrative and its protagonists, as well as giving a clear heroic slant to the narrative. The framing figures, referred to as Telemoni, follow an independent scheme that nonetheless relate to and enhance the significance of the narrative. The framing figures in the first room represent the Beatitudes, which are symbolic of the 8-pointed cross worn on the habit of the order. The scenes in the second room are flanked by virtues that are extolled in the main episodes. For the depiction of these, Spada used descriptions and images from Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, published in 1603. Characters from the Old Testament frame the scenes of the last room, and through their inscriptions, form a metaphor for the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ that run parallel to the tragic and victorious scenes in the order's history. Apart from this, these biblical figures represent the theme of exile, which characterizes the narrative of the Romes, where the knights were expelled from the Holy Land. An analysis of the format and iconography and sources of Spada's frescoes at the Grandmaster's Palace anchors them within the tradition of fresco decoration in Renaissance Europe, most notably Italy, through its informed patronage, intellectual narrative, decorative scheme, and contemporary stylistic manner. The episodes depicted have a clear relation to their literary and visual sources, which through this study have been defined as the literary work of the historian Giacomo Bozzio and the printed matter of Antonio Tempesta. These were 2 of the major influences in the narrative sequence and compositional format. The tone in Spada's fresco cycle threads a fine line between celebration, propaganda, and rhetoric, which, although intimately related, are expressed independently and tied to the ideals and governance of the order. The fresco cycle proclaims Wignacourt as the patron through the display of his coat of arms and marks the antiquity of lineage of the order. Scenes are framed by exemplary virtues of the knights and historic victories are celebrated. We will here examine the sources and protagonists of the commission in order to emphasize the propagandist slant of Spada's fresco cycle. The functions of propaganda and rhetoric use different modes to persuade the intended audience. Rhetoric, which conditioned Baroque art, moves along the lines of persuasion by showing the knights as primarily benevolent. The scenes direct the audience emotions to facilitate persuasion, and the use of the historical source for the narrative provides the proof for the argument. Let us identify and introduce the patrons. The humanistic quality in the narrative scheme shows it to be the work of a number of conoscenti that moved in the intimate circles of Grand Master Wignacourt's government. In the absence of complete documentation, it is possible to envision a scenario of the special committee assigned to this commission. This could possibly include the Bozzio brothers, Giacomo and Giannotto, who were both intimately tied to the order through their family history and roles as agent in Rome and vice-chancellor in Malta respectively, and who both had a profound knowledge of the history of the order. We will discuss Giacomo in further detail in relation to the literary sources. Another person who emerges as a protagonist is Fra Alessandro Orsi, through the Grand Master's letters in the archives and through his role as receiver for the order in Bologna. He was responsible for communicating the selection of Leonello Spada to the Grand Master. A significant role was surely played by Francesco dell'Antella, who acted as Wignacourt's cultural advisor on different occasions, and his documented interest in this commission and the order places him in direct involvement with the fresco cycle. Furthermore, the receiver in Naples, Vincenzo Carafa, was associated with the logistics for this commission, since Spada had to pass through Naples to purchase pigments and plaster for this particular work. It is clear that these protagonists were partly responsible for the propagandist tone in their directed use of sources and political presence on the island. Wignacourt's role as a notable patron is manifest through the commission of the last volume of Giacomo Bozzio's Historia and the manner in which he accommodated Caravaggio in Malta in 1607 and 1608, prior to Spada's journey to the island. The celebration of Caravaggio through his elevation to the knighthood of magistral obedience and the mechanics of patronage for the beheading of St. John the Baptist for the oratory of the Decolato in Valletta shows Wignacourt's predisposition to adorning the walls with images alluding to the order. It is evident that Wignacourt exercised direct control over Spada's fresco cycle through the involvement of his court, use of literary sources, and his presence in the palace whilst the artist was working on the commission. It is justified to suspect that Wignacourt's own agenda was further emphasized through the insistence of French Grand Masters and in the depiction of the miracle of the Virgin of Liesse in the first room, which was a personal devotion of his. Prior to Spada's undertaking, the choice of episodes to be depicted was probably discussed in detail by the characters just mentioned. The fact that there is an absence of minutes recording this in the books of the Grand Council may indicate that the choice of episodes was probably not discussed in detail at council level. It is here being proposed that the logistics for the commission of the fresco cycle probably started soon after the publication of Bozzio's third volume of his Historia in 1602. In fact, the earliest document related to the commission dates to 1606, when Francesco dell'Antella wrote a letter to Florence to commission a frescante for the palace. For some unknown reason, this commission did not materialize, At this stage, the choice of episodes should have been decided upon. It shows that Wignacourt wanted, or was advised to go for, a similar style to match the Palladini frescoes and the Perestaleccio ones in the Grand Council Room. Let us now concentrate on the narrative for the commission. In 1609, a few months after Caravaggio's departure, Wignacourt returned to his plans to decorate the palace. Instead of re-establishing contact with Florence, he wrote to Bologna to commission a frescante from there. This change of mind is extremely significant and shows that Wignacourt had stylistically revised his plans for the palace in order to follow the latest trends in Italian courts. The Bolognese had in fact emerged as protagonists in fresco painting and had taken the Roman art scene by storm. Foreign artists who were requested to work for the order would not only have been ensured safe conduct, but provisions and materials would have typically been collected from a port of call en route to Malta. The parameters for Spada's path to Malta are recorded in the archives and follow the previous arrangements set for the Florentine frescante, whereby he was to stop in Naples for materials and provisions. Spada is last documented in Bologna at the end of November 1609 and possibly left for Malta along with an assistant who remains unknown soon after. The orders receiver in Naples paid Spada 200 ducats to purchase materials, which, although are not specified in documents, may have included plaster. Let's discuss the artist and why he was chosen for the commission. Spada emerges as a versatile figure in the first decade of the 17th century, where he joined the reformist climate within the Accademia degli Incaminati in Bologna and followed the latest stylistic trends from the Carracci artists. By remaining in Bologna, he became attached to Ludovico Carracci. Undeniably, Leonello Spada, when in Malta, could not have failed to make comparisons between the Grand Master's palace and the palaces he knew well in Bologna. Spada was clearly well versed in this tradition, and this is evident through his earlier work in Palazzo Bonfiglioli Rossi, where he collaborated with two other artists for the decoration of 3 rooms. At times, it is difficult to decipher individual work within the scenes at Palazzo Bonfiglioli Rossi. However, Spada's figures seem to invade real space in their acute naturalness and sculptural quality. The dimensions of the frieze, the way the color scheme of the frescoes match the ceiling palette, and the depiction of Telemoni in these rooms attest to the typology of fresco decoration Spada was versed in, rooted in the developments established by the Carraccis in Bolognese palaces such as Palazzo Fava and Palazzo Magnami. Wignacourt's requirements for the artists are clearly outlined in the letter to Alessandro Orsi, and it appears that these were discussed in detail prior to the selection of Spada. The artist was selected on account of his reputation and according to how well he fit the predefined criteria that I will soon discuss. Wignacourt specifically requested an artist who could work both in oil and fresco, which was highly valued in the 17th century due to the potential for commissions in different media and uniformity in the decoration. Spada was required to imbue his scenes with highly charged colors, pratica nel colorire, and through his use of illuminative and realistic hues, brought Bozzio's text to life in the most relatable way. The Emilian naturalistic coloring that was characteristic of Spada's early years clearly emerges in the Maltese frescoes and creates a comparison to the works of Vasari in Sala del Trionfo della Virtù in Casa Vasari in Arezzo and the Zuccari artists in the Farnese Palace in Caprarola. The intensity of his palette in his frescoes is achieved through a foundation of bright colors, which are built up through secco highlights and additions to achieve the appearance of chiaroscuro. Spada's bravura in painting and quadratura was well known, and although Wignacourt does not specifically mention the word, his prerequisite and reference to Fresco con fondamento di disegno di prospettiva shows that he envisioned something typical of the term. The modern definition of this typology of painting within the Bolognese context is best defined as the new manner of mural decoration in Bologna, which employed a frieze with scenes divided by Atlantes of semi-architectural character, that aptly applies to Spada's typology of decoration for the Grandmaster's palace. A narrative painted on a wall as a framed picture was referred to as quadro riportato, which to 17th century concepts suggested that a framed panel painting had been translated to the medium of fresco. The condition for prestezza in Spada's execution was probably a logistical requirement for Wignacourt. However, it relates to the technique of painting with speed. Prestezza translates to rapidity, which was a skill admired in artists as long as the technique and quality of the work was not compromised. The fact that Wignacourt required an artist that could work with speed and prestezza could indicate that he wanted Spada to finish before the chapter general he was organizing for April 1612. The last of Wignacourt's requests regarded Spada's code of conduct, bontà de costume e del giudizioso et amabile suo modo di procedere, which alludes to the Grandmaster's bitter experience with Caravaggio. The subject of the early history of the order was completely novel for the artist, and we will now discuss the literary and visual sources Spada should have utilized to forcefully illustrate the narrative. An understanding of these scenes has highlighted the themes, namely arrivals and departures, battles and alliances, and relics and miracles, which are presented by the prominent characters of the order and the wider Crusader context in the stipulated time of the narrative across a multitude of territories. The episodes depicted have a clear relation to their literary and visual sources, and this research concentrates on defining the literary work of the historian Giacomo Bozzio and the printed matter of Antonio Tempesta as two of the major influences. Let us discuss Giacomo Bozzio first. Giacomo Bozzio was a letterato and seasoned diplomat in the order's affairs, with degrees in civil and canonical laws. Bozzio was not a knight of the order, but had held the position as agente cronista for almost 4 decades. His family connections and knowledge of the history and administration of the order earned him this title and role within the order's office in Rome, where he resided. It is clear that the narrative for Spada's fresco cycle was dictated by the literary sources, and a comparative study confirmed that the wording on the majority of the titoli of the episodes is directly quoted from Bozzio's Historia. Bozzio's Historia, published in 3 volumes under the magistracy and patronage of Grandmaster Verdal and Wignacourt, was the first successfully completed historical account on the Order of St. John, from its institution up until those contemporary times. Bozzio maps out the detailed narrative using a number of published and unpublished sources, which were comprised of previous attempts at recording the history, archival evidence from the order itself and the Vatican, and memoirs from his own family members, who were protagonists prior and contemporary to the knight's move to Malta. Naturally, the tone is favourable to the order due to the intimate ties of Bozzio's family, his own role as agent, and the fact that the Grandmaster himself appointed him to publish the work. His writings, which are buttressed by a number of allegories, religious symbolism, and political evocations, show his commitment and profound knowledge of the order and the potentiality of rhetoric. It is here being studied that through his well-documented role of chronista, Giacomo was consulted for the fresco narrative. Thus, specific extracts from Bozzio's text provide a wonderful description of Spada's frescoes. The first 2 volumes were published in 1594, after being commissioned by Grandmaster Verdal. The first volume covered the period from the institution of the Order of the Knights in the 11th century until 1291, when the knights were expelled from Ptolemade. All of the episodes in the first room and the second room were taken from the first volume. The second volume covered the period when the knights moved to Rhodes in 1291 until their expulsion in 1522. This volume defined the narrative for the third room, whilst the last scene was lifted from the third volume. The third volume, which was published in 1602 and dedicated to Grandmaster Wignacourt, continued from the second volume and began with the knights wandering off to Rhodes in 1522. This volume brings the history up to contemporary times and concludes with Wignacourt becoming Grandmaster and ruler of the new city of Valletta. It is recorded in the archives that Alessandro Orsi had a complete copy of Bozzio's Historia at the time of contact with Spada in August 1609. Thus, it is very possible that Spada began to prepare and read Bozzio while still in Bologna. The episode titles must have been presented to Spada, who would have familiarized himself with the relevant text. Time here precludes me from discussing each of the 24 episodes, so I will only concentrate on 4 scenes that illustrate the use of Bozzio's text, Antonio Tempesta's prints, and highlight Spada's technique. Spada's use of Bozzio is evident in the frescoes themselves. An example that illustrates this is one of the earliest and significant events in Bozzio's Historia, which was selected as the first episode for the narrative of Spada's fresco cycle. This episode shows the institution of the order, with Peter the Hermit leaving Jerusalem to canvass for a crusading movement in 1060. The dates in Bozzio's text and Spada's wording are almost identical. The title of the episode is noted in a cartouche beneath the scene and reads: Padre Pietro eremita dall'Ospitalieri di Gerusalemme per andare in Francia a Papa Urbano II, dove ne segui poi la spedizione della crociata per recuperazione di Terra Santa, l'anno 1060. This is directly linked to Bozzio's text as shown in the common language underlined between the two, that notes the date, characters, and action. This is the case with the majority of the episodes in the fresco cycle. A number of Spada's scenes show a direct illustration of the description provided by the text, where he did not merely copy the titolo, but created an image that summarized Bozzio's, at times, lengthy narrative. An example is the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, a scene depicted in the first room. This is narrated over a number of pages in Bozzio's text. The episode specifically shows the knights exiting the city of Jerusalem, whilst at the same time, through a different point of entry, the Ottomans parading through the city gates after their victory. And this is presented by Spada in great accuracy to Bozzio's text. Partiti essendo Gerusalemme i Latini, entro dall'altra parte Saladino. Although this detail is not included in the titolo, it is accurately narrated through Spada's visuals. It is clear that Spada pondered heavily on Bozzio's text and imbues the figures of the knights with gestures that show, as Bozzio puts it, gravissima e incomparabile perdita. All of the episodes in the cycle attest to a thorough study of the specific narrative described in Bozzio. This is again the case with the majority of episodes in the fresco cycle, most notably in the episode St. Louis of France handed over by the Sultan of Egypt to the Hospitallers in 1250 in the second room, and Zizimi, brother of the Sultan Bayezid II, is received in Rhodes by Grandmaster Pierre d'Aubusson in 1482 in the third room. There are few instances where Spada depicts details that are not included in Bozzio's narrative, such as in the episode King Andrea of Hungary is honored with the Mezza Croce by Master Guerino da Montacuto in 1218, where although the context is narrated in Bozzio, the detail of the knighthood is not mentioned in his text. This could confirm the active role of an advisor for the narrative. that could have perhaps been on site while Spada was carrying out the work. Spada had rarely painted scenes of combat prior to the Grand Master's palace, and thus relied on visual sources for the depiction of battle scenes, which amount to half of the total episodes in the fresco cycle, in line with the many battles that condition the order's history. Strong correlations between Spada's scenes and the work of Antonio Tempesta, a reputable designer, engraver, and artist in Rome at the time, show the latter to be the main visual source. Interestingly, Giacomo Bozzio was also a patron of Tempesta in Rome, and one of his most notable works, a map of Rome, was dedicated to the historian. This attests to Wignacourt and his court's direct control over the sources that influenced this fresco cycle. To further this point, Spada quoted an engraving from the Statuta Hospitalis Hierusalemme, published under Grand Master Verdad, where the scene depicting the first chapter general is clearly lifted from this book. Antonio Tempesta's scenes of combat depict the theme of violenza plastica, that recreates a staged battle adapted for painted work, resulting in the effect of harmonious violence and somewhat peaceful warfare that is far removed from the reality of the subject. This definition of the term violenza plastica was applied to Spada's work at the palace, and the case in point is the episode of Master Bertrand de Camp's fights against the Turks in Antioch in 1248 in the second room, which can be directly compared to Tempesta's The Israelites battling the Amalekalites from the Battles of the Old Testament series. In a similar manner to that in Tempesta's Prince, Spada presents the action of the cavalry battle on the frontal plane. The horses are expressively charged and match the impression of violence and emotions associated with the soldiers engaged in battle. The principal figures embody the actions of retreating, charging, attacking, and falling, creating a sense of dynamism in the scene. Tempesta used the charging action to create a curved movement of the troops through the composition in space, as he did in the pencil study of the battle between the Christians and the Ottomans. This format is repeated by Spada in Amadeo IV, Count of Savoia, joins the order at Rhodes to defeat the Turks in 1310. Tempesta built his compositions from a long-stemming tradition rooted in the works of the Renaissance masters, where they presented battles as compendiums of different poses and views of the human body, riding in pain or poised in attack, whether on horseback or on foot. Tempesta follows this tradition and creates an engraving that can be widely disseminated and thus increases its potential for influence. One of the leading characteristics of these battle scenes is the idea that harmony and order can coexist in a naturally chaotic scene. There is no harsh realism or violence that one would expect to see in such an episode. The artist instead allows for certain incongruences in favor of the overall scheme of the scene. Let us speak briefly about Spada's technique with the scene of the Hospitallers restore the walls of Jerusalem in 1229 from the second Rome. Spada retained his fresco technique, mastered in Bologna, and reproduced it in the regional setting of Malta. To observe Spada's technique, scaffolding was set up at the palace, and with the use of raking light, many of the characteristics could be observed. A similar study through direct observation was also undertaken with Spada's fresco in San Procolo in Bologna, depicting the miracle of loaves and fishes, so that I could create a comparison and indeed confirm that Spada's fresco technique was retained in Malta. This on-site direct study revealed the amount of giornate, which can be defined as the amount of work carried out before the plaster dries. In the case of this scene, 6 giornate sections are visible. Spada generally divided the scenes in a grid-like manner, while some giornata lines, as seen through the figure of the stone breaker, follow the contours of the figures. This study also revealed the amount of incision marks on the works, thus highlighting that Spada would have incised his cartone onto the wet plaster. Puntata marks, where the cartone was attached to the plaster, can also be observed. Pencil and tracing marks were discovered, as well as one pentimento in the scene of Falk III, King of Jerusalem, hands over the castle of Bet Giblen to the master Ramon de Puy in 1131. One of the main issues I had with the fresco cycle was the question why Spada did not sign what can be considered as his most important commission outside Bologna, and one of his best works. He often signs works with the letter L over a sword to represent Spada. And after a thorough examination of every inch of the frescoes, I had concluded that he might not have been allowed to sign the work. However, one day, as I was walking into the last room, as many knights would have done before me, I glanced up at the last scene, and there he was looking out at me, a self-portrait of Leonello Spada. Through a comparison with his self-portrait, I was able to confirm this and identify the Bolognese artist in his own frescoes. To conclude, the fresco cycle is a fascinating example of patronage in the regional setting of Malta. It shows the Italian tradition of Spada's contemporary aesthetic. Through its strong affiliation to Bozzio's Historia, it reveals Wignacourt's political interests as a patron with clear propagandist motives. The form, function, and historic subject of the frescoes place the cycle within the great tradition of Italian historical frescoes. It is not known how long Spada stayed on the island, but biographers mention that he was celebrated by Wignacourt and given a cross for his work. An analysis on the themes and iconography of the fresco cycle reveal the intricate scheme for the narrative and the multiple layers of propaganda and celebration laced throughout the episodes. The literary and visual sources for the fresco cycle have been investigated through this research, and the use of contemporary sources attests to the informed patronage in updating the established standard to the order's requirements. The use of depictions of battle scenes built on traditional aesthetics and the application of visual sources from the order itself presents the most vivid form of propaganda. Despite the regional Maltese context and difficulties involved with fresco painting on the island, Spada produced a work grounded in tradition as a testament to Wignacourt's magistracy. Thank you.